Welcome to the Psychology of Us. This podcast is created by RJ Starr, a public intellectual and independent psychology educator. The material presented is educational and interpretive, examining psychological life as a domain of understanding rather than intervention. It does not provide therapy, diagnosis, or professional guidance. Each episode stands as a complete work of public psychological inquiry.
Have you ever felt just completely overwhelmed by your own conflicting thoughts?
Oh, absolutely.
Like your fluctuating emotions and the actual stories you tell yourself about who you are?
It's exhausting.
It really is. And if you're nodding your head right now, you are definitely not alone. It feels like we are all walking around with these incredibly complex internal operating systems, but nobody ever handed us the user manual.
Right. There's no instruction booklet.
Exactly. But today, we're going to change that. For this deep dive, we are pulling from a truly fascinating 2026 conceptual monograph. It's titled Psychological Architecture, a structural integration of mind, emotion, identity, and meaning.
And it is by independent scholar RJ Starr.
Yes, RJ Starr. Now, look, we all know about cognitive biases and trauma responses. We've covered them extensively on this show.
Right. You probably already know your attachment style.
Totally. You can spot a cognitive distortion from a mile away. But Starr's monograph asks a completely different question. It asks, how do those isolated glitches actually communicate with each other?
Which is the real question.
It is. So our mission today is to shortcut your path to understanding your own psychological blueprint. Instead of drowning in a sea of isolated self-help silos, you are going to get the master map.
And that master map is what makes this perspective so desperately needed right now. Starr argues that human experience simply does not unfold in neat little disciplinary boxes.
No, it doesn't.
You don't experience a moment of intense anxiety in a vacuum, completely separate from your sense of who you are or your logical reasoning.
Right, they all happen at once.
Exactly. But for decades, that is exactly how the fields of psychology and neuroscience have been structured. We have cognitive science over in one building, affective neuroscience in another, and meaning-making is basically, well, it's relegated to the philosophy department.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the core problem identified here is that psychology has become hyper-specialized.
Quite specialized.
We have these highly detailed, incredibly precise local maps of specific symptoms and personality traits. If you have a phobia, we have a map for that.
Right.
If you have an insecure attachment, we have a map for that too. But we completely lack a unified structural blueprint.
We're missing the big picture.
We are accumulating this endless vocabulary of psychological terms, but we aren't deepening our understanding of how they all connect in real time.
And this fragmentation isn't just an academic problem. It genuinely harms us in practice.
How so?
Well, when we treat something like an identity issue or a recurring negative thought pattern in total isolation, we are missing the forest for the trees. We fail to see how a shift in one area structurally cascades into all the others.
Ah, okay.
We try to fix a negative thought pattern using logic without addressing the underlying emotional regulation that is actually powering that thought.
It's like trying to fix a leak in your roof by just constantly mopping the floor.
That is exactly what it's like. You have to understand the architecture of the entire house to know why the water is getting in and where it's flowing.
I love that analogy, and that brings us right to the foundation of the house. Starr introduces 4 foundational domains that make up our psychological architecture.
Right, the 4 pillars.
Mind, emotion, identity, and meaning. Let's start with the first room in the house, the mind. Starr's paper completely flipped my view on this because they argue the mind isn't just a passive recording device.
No, it's not a filing cabinet of memories.
Not at all.
It's highly active. The monograph defines the mind as an active inference system. What that means is your brain is constantly generating hypotheses and predictive models about reality.
It's guessing.
It's always guessing. It is always trying to anticipate what's going to happen next. Its primary goal, mathematically speaking, is to minimize what the author calls prediction error.
Okay.
And the crucial takeaway for anyone listening is this: your mind strongly prefers stability over objective accuracy. It wants the situation to align with what it already expects.
Okay, hold on. Let me challenge that for a second. Shouldn't our evolutionary survival depend on seeing reality accurately? Why would the brain prefer a comfortable lie over the objective truth? That seems like a massive design flaw.
It sounds like one until you factor in Energy conservation.
Energy.
Yeah, processing entirely new, unexpected information, updating your models of reality takes a massive amount of metabolic energy. Your brain is essentially lazy by design to save calories.
Oh, wow.
So if new information contradicts its models, the mind will often defensively reinterpret that information just to preserve its internal coherence.
Because it's easier.
It is much easier to say, that person who gave me a weird look is just a jerk, rather than I need to reevaluate my entire understanding of how I present myself to the world.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. And it perfectly sets up the second domain, emotion. In this architecture, emotion is simply a rapid signaling system.
Oh, it is.
It tells you what is salient, what is a threat, and what is an opportunity. What I really appreciated here is how the author practically begs us to stop romanticizing or pathologizing our feelings. An emotion is just data. The problems we face don't actually arise from the feelings themselves, right?
Correct. A feeling of intense grief or sudden anger isn't a structural failure. The issues only occur when there is dysregulation, suppression, or active avoidance of those feelings.
When we block.
Exactly. When you don't process the emotional data, the system gets backed up. The energy of that unacknowledged feeling has to go somewhere, and it usually ends up warping the other domains.
Which flows right into the third domain, identity.
Right.
Identity functions as the narrative glue of your psychological architecture. It stabilizes your day-to-day experience by organizing all your roles, relationships, and values into a continuous, predictable story of who you are.
It holds everything together.
But Starr warns that this narrative stabilization system can become incredibly fragile.
It becomes fragile when it lacks flexibility.
Right.
Let's say your identity is heavily overdependent on external validation, or it's tied entirely to a single role.
It's like your career.
Exactly. If your entire narrative glue is, I am a high-performing lawyer, you have created a very brittle structure. It works great as long as you're winning cases.
But what if you lose?
Then it becomes highly vulnerable to total collapse. If that single external factor is removed or threatened, the whole thing shatters.
But what happens when that identity story loses its plot? That's where the fourth room comes in, meaning.
The final domain.
Right. If identity is the glue, meaning is the temporal anchor, it organizes your long-term directionality. It's your existential orientation toward the future.
And that future orientation is vital for present moment stability. Meaning is what contextualizes transient, momentary distress.
Think about it like this. Let's say you have two people pulling a brutal 16-hour overnight shift at a hospital. Person A is a medical resident who has dreamed of being a surgeon since childhood.
Okay?
Person B is just doing data entry to pay off a short-term debt, and they hate the job. They are both experiencing the exact same physical exhaustion and stress.
The same emotional data.
Exactly. But for person A, that stress is anchored in a deep sense of meaning. They know why they are doing it, so the temporary pain becomes much easier to regulate.
Right.
Person B doesn't have that temporal anchor, so the distress feels intolerable.
What's fascinating here is a monograph's central thesis. These four domains do not operate independently.
They're all connected.
They form a system of reciprocal constraints. You cannot change one without recalibrating all the others. Emotional signals influence cognitive interpretation.
Okay.
Those interpretive frames then reshape your identity commitments. Your identity structures guide how you attribute meaning, and your meaning frameworks alter the emotional significance of events.
Just like the medical resident example.
Precisely. They are continuously adjusting in real time, responding to one another to maintain systemic stability.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because understanding how these domains constrain each other finally explains why we get stuck in destructive bad habits.
It maps it out perfectly.
It does. Starr outlines these structural loops that occur when the architecture fails. Let's walk through the one that I think every single listener will instantly recognize, the emotional avoidance loop.
It's a loop we all fall into.
Oh, definitely.
It begins in the emotion domain. You experience an affective signal, a feeling, that simply exceeds your regulatory tolerance.
That's too much.
It might be a deep sense of inadequacy, intense shame, or overwhelming anxiety. Whatever it is, it's too painful to actually sit with.
So, because you can't tolerate the feeling, you avoid it. Let's say you receive some critical feedback at work and it triggers a massive wave of inadequacy.
Right.
But the energy of that emotion doesn't just vanish into thin air, it cascades immediately into the mind.
And the mind, remember, hates prediction errors. It wants stability. So to protect you from that intolerable feeling of inadequacy, your brain starts generating interpretations to rationalize or minimize the feedback.
It shifts the blame.
It completely shifts the blame. You start thinking, my boss doesn't know what they're talking about, or this company's metrics are totally flawed.
Then, once the mind has rationalized the avoidance, the cascade moves into the identity domain. Your self-narrative actually reorganizes to exclude that destabilizing feeling.
Yes.
You might adopt a rigid identity of being the misunderstood genius or the rebel who doesn't play office politics. You build a story about yourself that actively repels the feeling of inadequacy.
Finally, this pushes all the way into the meaning domain. Your entire worldview narrows to justify this avoidance.
Wow.
You might decide that corporate life is inherently toxic, or that trusting authority figures is always a mistake. You've now built an entire philosophical framework just to avoid feeling that initial pang of inadequacy.
And the tragic irony of this entire loop is that it works.
It really does.
It achieves immediate systemic stability. You don't have to feel inadequate today. But long-term, your psychological integration is severely weakened.
Because the initial emotion remains completely unmetabolized.
Exactly. It's still sitting there structurally active beneath the surface, forcing your mind, your identity, and your meaning domains to work overtime. You have to become more and more rigid, more defensive, just to keep that one feeling locked in the basement.
And that rigidity makes you incredibly vulnerable to the second major structural failure outlined in the monograph, The Identity Collapse Cycle.
This one sounds intense.
It is. This usually triggers when the narrative stabilization system can no longer absorb the strain of reality.
Let's paint a picture for the listener. Imagine you experience a sudden, massive life transition. You unexpectedly lose that job you've built your whole life around.
Or you go through a devastating, out-of-the-blue divorce.
Right. If your identity was over-consolidated around that specific role, if your entire structural integrity relied on being the provider or the perfect spouse, that singular narrative shatters.
And glue dissolves.
Your identity domain collapses completely.
And because the domains are deeply interconnected, the collapse doesn't stay contained to your sense of self. Anxiety or grief instantly floods the system, completely overwhelming your emotion domain.
It overflows.
Because your emotional regulation is overwhelmed, the mind domain panics. Its interpretive filtering dramatically narrows, and suddenly it starts seeing threats everywhere. Your cognitive priors shift.
So when you say cognitive prior shifts, you mean the baseline assumptions the brain uses to predict reality, right?
Exactly. Before the collapse, your baseline assumption might have been, people generally like me and I am competent.
Makes sense.
But after the collapse, your priors shift to anticipate rejection, betrayal, or failure at every single turn. The world is suddenly mapped as a highly dangerous place.
It just changes everything.
It does. Finally, this cascades into the meaning domain, fracturing your temporal coherence. Your future orientation weakens. You find yourself entirely unmoored, unable to picture what your life looks like next week, let alone next year. The anchor is gone.
It is a terrifying cascade to experience, but seeing it mapped out structurally like this is oddly comforting.
It takes the blame away.
It really does. It proves that you aren't fundamentally broken or uniquely flawed. Your internal domains are just out of alignment, which naturally leads us to the big question, how do we fix the alignment?
The golden question.
Starr introduces something called the Emotional Maturity Index. Now, I want to clarify right up front. This is not a moral judgment.
Not at all.
It's not a high score you are trying to achieve to prove you are a more enlightened person than your neighbor.
Far from it. The index is purely a structural measure of bandwidth and flexibility across your domains.
Okay.
Lower structural maturity is characterized by rigidity, defensive stabilization, and a very narrow tolerance for emotional complexity. If you have low structural maturity, you require the world to be very predictable to feel okay.
And higher structural maturity.
That is the capacity to experience and regulate diverse, conflicting emotions without your identity destabilizing or your cognitive schemas becoming rigid. This raises an important question. Is stability actually the ultimate goal of our psychological architecture?
And that is the counterintuitive twist of the whole paper. Highly stable systems aren't necessarily healthy systems.
No, they aren't. Starr makes a brilliant distinction between maximal stabilization and optimal integration.
Right.
If your mind resolves all prediction errors by just ignoring them or suppressing them, and your identity narrative is totally impermeable to new data, you will look incredibly stable on the outside.
Like a rock.
You might look like the most confident, unwavering person in the room, but internally you are just rigidly dogmatic. If a worldview is close to novelty, it might be stable, but it lacks any adaptive flexibility when the environment changes.
So the actual goal is optimal integration, which the author beautifully defines as permeability under constraint.
Yes, permeability under constraint.
It is the ability to take in new disconfirming information, update your worldview, and actually feel complex emotions, all without your entire identity collapsing. You remain coherent, but capable of reorganization.
So how do we move from rigid stabilization to dynamic integration? The text offers a mechanism called emotional repatterning,
Okay.
and this is where the structural map really proves its worth. Emotional repatterning doesn't start with trying to change your thoughts. It doesn't start with trying to rewrite your identity.
It doesn't.
No, it starts entirely in the emotion domain.
So practically speaking, what does that look like? If I'm stuck in one of these avoidance loops, how do I actually repattern it?
The solution is to intentionally expand your regulatory tolerance. You have to practice actually feeling the physical sensations of the emotions you have been habitually avoiding without immediately jumping into your mind to rationalize them.
That's tough.
It is tough. But when you finally allow that unmetabolized affect to be processed, when you sit with the anxiety or the inadequacy until it naturally dissipates, the most amazing structural cascade happens in reverse.
The reverse cascade.
Exactly. As your emotional bandwidth increases, your cognitive schemas naturally begin to soften.
Just to make sure we're totally clear on the jargon by schema, you mean the mental rules we write for ourselves, like people will always let me down, or I have to be perfect to be loved?
Yes, those underlying rules and frameworks. When you process the avoided emotion, the mind stops defending against prediction errors because the emotion is no longer viewed as a lethal threat.
It realizes you're safe.
Exactly. It starts updating its priors based on reality, not fear. And because your mind is no longer guarding the basement door, your identity narrative can naturally expand to incorporate all the messy human experiences you previously had to exclude.
So what does this all mean? How does this theoretical architecture actually change the way we live and grow on a Tuesday afternoon?
Well, Starr actually proposes a specific, testable research hypothesis that brings this right down to ground level.
Let's hear it.
The hypothesis states that clinical interventions targeting your emotional regulatory capacity will produce far greater long-term flexibility in your identity than interventions that merely target your cognitive distortions.
Wow.
Think about what that means for a moment. If cognition operates primarily as a coherence-preserving system, if your thoughts are just trying to protect your emotional state, then simply trying to restructure your thoughts through pure logic without expanding your emotional tolerance is basically useless.
It doesn't stick.
It might produce a surface-level reinterpretation, but the underlying structural rigidity will remain. The leak is still there, you're just using a nicer mop.
Which is the ultimate practical takeaway for you listening right now. If you feel incredibly stuck in a rigid negative thought pattern, or if you feel like you keep playing out the exact same toxic relational dynamics, trying to simply outthink the problem is a losing battle.
You can outthink it.
Starr is definitive on this. Regulation precedes interpretation. You cannot force your mind to adopt a healthier perspective if your emotional signaling system is constantly overwhelmed by avoidance.
Right.
You have to increase your emotional bandwidth, your capacity to sit with the physical discomfort of anxiety, inadequacy, or sadness before your mind will ever allow your identity to truly change.
It shifts the entire paradigm of personal growth. It isn't about excavating some hidden, essential, true self that got lost along the way. It is a constructivist process.
You're building it.
Exactly. Growth is literally expanding your system's architectural capacity to incorporate previously excluded experiences into a wider, more flexible narrative.
And that brings us to the ultimate synthesis of this deep dive. You are not a random collection of isolated symptoms. You are not your permanent personality traits, and you aren't just a bundle of faulty cognitive biases. You are a deeply interconnected, dynamic architectural system. Your stability, your joy, and your adaptability depend entirely on all four of your rooms: mind, emotion, identity, and meaning, communicating effectively and honestly with one another.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look closely at that final domain, meaning.
Yes.
Starr notes that meaning provides our temporal coherence. It gives us a future orientation that reaches back to stabilize our immediate emotions and our present identity. But we are living in an era defined by profound external volatility.
That's putting it mildly.
It raises an incredibly provocative question for you to mull over. If our internal architecture relies so heavily on anticipating a coherent future to maintain daily stability, what happens to our psychological blueprint when the external world makes the future entirely unpredictable?
That is a huge question.
How do you build structural alignment and temporal coherence inside yourself when the existential ground outside your front door is constantly shifting?
That is a profound question to carry with you this week. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into your own psychological architecture. Keep observing your own domains, pay attention to those emotional loops, and keep exploring.
This has been The Psychology of Us. The work presented here is part of a public psychological archive by RJ Starr. It is educational and interpretive, not clinical or advisory. Episodes are published as finished reflections and are intended to be encountered as complete works.